TJ Ford was one of the most exciting young players in the league before he was ultimately forced to retire after becoming paralyzed on the court not once, but twice early in his career. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer, and this is your #1 source for learning about the unique medical side of the world of sports. Ford's case is one of the most unique across any sport, and in this video, we're going to take a closer look at what exactly happened that led to him stepping away from the game. The first episode of paralysis occurred in 2004 in a game against the Timberwolves. Here, as Ford was driving into the lane, he got stopped, but there was no real contact that was appreciated right away as he was in the air. Nothing abnormal to his head, nothing abnormal to his neck, but as Ford came down to the ground, his feet came out from underneath him, and unfortunately he landed really hard, boom, right there directly on his bottom, which sent this force up through his spine. If you watch closely here, it also caused this really brief, sudden kind of jerking motion of his neck as his body jarred down to the ground right there, causing that neck and cervical spine to also shake in addition to that axial load coming up from how he made contact at the lower part of his back. Ford lay motionless on the ground. This wasn't the first time that he had experienced symptoms like this, and so it was all too familiar. In the case of any downed athlete where we're worried about a neck injury, as demonstrated by the fact that Ford didn't have feeling or muscle control in his arms or his legs, the first thing we do is we stabilize the cervical spine, as the medical providers are doing here. If there's any fracture to the bones of the neck, we don't want to cause any excessive movement that could further damage the underlying spinal cord. Ford was then placed on a spine board and taken off the court in a stretcher with his neck and spine stabilized. This would happen again with Ford later in his career, but before we continue our learning, I want to give a quick shout out to the sponsor of today's video. Today's video is sponsored by the maker of my #1 go-to choice for earbuds, Raycon. Raycon wireless earbuds are the perfect gift for the upcoming holiday season, whether it's your friend who likes to listen to audiobooks and podcasts, or your family member who loves working out at the gym to their favorite tunes. Mine are a must-have for virtual meetings thanks to the slim, very low profile design, but I'm also using them at the gym and just in the evenings when I'm sitting at home, getting stuff done for work or researching for my videos. The new everyday earbuds offer an improved rubber oil look and feel, and these sleek optimized gel tips for that perfect in-ear fit. Raycons offer 8 hours of playtime and a 32-hour battery life in this sleek little case that takes USB-C charging. There's also a built-in mic so you can take calls at the simple press of a button. Click the link in the description box or go to buyraycon.com/BrianMD to unlock exclusive deals up to 20% off your Raycon order. Raycons start at half the price of other premium brands, but honestly sound just as good. And Raycons come with a 45-day happiness guarantee, so you can feel more reassured with your purchase. So if you want to help support this channel and treat either yourself or a loved one to a nice holiday gift, then be sure to check out the link in the description below. Thank you again to Raycon for sponsoring this video, and let's get back to our learning. TJ Ford suffered recurrent cervical spinal cord injuries known as a cervical cord neuropraxia because of an underlying diagnosis of congenital spinal stenosis. Let's break down some of those terms. With our biodigital anatomy tool here, I've highlighted the skull and then of course the bones of the cervical spine. If we zoom in and focus specifically on one of these vertebrae and look at it from the kind of this top-down view with the front of the neck being over here, the back of the neck right here, what we can see are a couple of key portions of these vertebrae. The first is this portion. This is the vertebral body. And then next we have the vertebral canal or the spinal canal, which is the area where the actual spinal cord is going to travel through the spinal column. Stenosis means narrowing. So when somebody has cervical stenosis, it means they have narrowing of this cervical canal where the spinal cord travels, which can lead to pinching or damage of the spinal cord. The fact that this was congenital means basically TJ Ford had this anatomic predisposition from how he was born and how he developed. Ford went on to have surgery fusing his C3 and C4 vertebrae, essentially trying to manage and improve some of that tightening on the spinal cord. But unfortunately, after returning to the game a couple years later, it was on this fast break play where the top of Ford's head was struck and he became paralyzed once again on the court. Ford commented later on that it was once he was in midair and the top of his head was hit that he became paralyzed essentially before he even hit the court. Remember, with that narrowing on the spinal cord, any excessive extension, bending the neck backwards, flexion coming forward, or axial load on the top of the head can cause more stretching and pinching, damaging that spinal cord over a short-term period. Here as Ford goes up for this layup, as his head is hit, it gets knocked quickly into this forced hyperextension, which causes that pinching on the spinal cord, leading to that transient episode of paralysis in his arms and legs. Of course, once again, cervical precautions were implemented with stabilizing of Ford's neck, and he ultimately had to be taken off the court once again on a stretcher before he could be further evaluated. As I mentioned early on, each of these episodes themselves are something called cervical cord neuropraxia. Think of this like a stinger, but instead of it affecting the brachial plexus or the nerve roots in just one arm, it basically affects the whole spinal cord. By definition, it's transient, meaning it's a temporary impairment on the spinal cord, typically from some sort of mechanical stretching that causes this abnormal activation and sort of shutdown of the nerves going through the spinal cord. There's no actual cutting or severing of the nerves in the spinal cord. It's just this temporary period where those nerves basically aren't functioning. With all of these episodes, Ford was eventually able to regain his strength as those nerves start to sort of reset and recover over typically the course of minutes to hours. The final episode of this occurred when Ford was just trying to go up and get a rebound. But once again, you can see it's not just the impact to his body, but it's that sudden movement of his neck that once again causes that spinal cord neuropraxia because of that congenital narrowing of his canal. These are the types of impacts that in somebody with normal anatomy and no degeneration of their spine aren't typically going to cause any issue. But when you've already got some narrowing in place, you're at a higher risk, so these lower impact types of mechanisms can cause more significant spinal cord impairment. Fortunately, this episode wasn't as severe, and Ford was able to come off the court with just some assistance rather than the stretcher. Historically, one of the ways we evaluated athletes for this was with something called the torg ratio. Essentially, we'd look at the ratio between that vertebral body width and the spinal canal measurement, and if it met a certain criteria, we considered an athlete as being high risk and having this congenital spinal stenosis. But we then discovered it really didn't take into account the just innate bony changes with particularly football players having really big beefy vertebral bodies, and so that torg ratio is now kind of outdated. One thing we'll more commonly do nowadays is look at the CSF, or the cerebral spinal fluid reserve. Essentially, if we do an MRI of the neck, you can see the spinal cord here in gray, and this bright white is the spinal fluid surrounding the spinal cord. If that canal is excessively narrow, there's not going to be as much reserve or as much spinal fluid around the spinal cord. And so that's one way that we can sort of pick up whether people have congenital stenosis and are going to be considered more high risk. So in summary here, TJ Ford had congenital cervical stenosis, meaning he was born and developed with this abnormality that led to an excessively narrowed canal where the spinal cord travels down through the vertebral bodies. Over his playing career, with these recurrent episodes of contact that led to these sudden jerking movements or forces transmitted through his neck like we saw here, or with this impact to the top of his head on a drive causing forced hyperextension, or the very first bout where he simply fell to the ground, had a jerking movement of his head, and a significant force transmitted up through the spinal cord, he developed these recurrent episodes of cervical cord neuropraxia, transient episodes of paralysis or nerve impairment because of the spinal cord being pinched high up in his neck. In all reality, this is probably something that's occurring in athletes more often. We just don't hear about it because players might not be as high profile as someone like TJ Ford was. But the fact that his was so severe as it was, and even led to his retirement, certainly makes it one of the more unusual cases in the world of sports medicine. That's it for the video, everybody. Thank you as always for watching. Let me know any questions or comments down below, and until next time, we'll see you later. Bye.